As you can see, the topic we're discussing is universities and free expression. It is a very, very hot current topic across the nation. In fact, things that are happening on campuses here are getting global attention. Normally, I give a little outline of what we're talking about, but I don't think that's necessary in this case because of who our guest is, his stature, but also his role as a leader in this conversation. In fact, a provocateur of conversation about this issue. So please welcome to the stage our guest this morning, the president of the University of Chicago, Robert Zimmer. Hi, Bob.
Good to see you.
Sorry, I'm not standing to welcome you. You wrote an editorial, published an editorial 2 years ago this month that got an enormous amount of attention. I'll just read the opening sentence. Free speech is at risk at the very institution where it should be assured, the university. Elaborate. Make your case with examples and compelling logic.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me start with one phrase in there, which is this question about the very place that it should be protected and enhanced. And so one question about free expression on university campuses is, why does it matter? What difference does it make? Is this just some abstract theological principle? Is it about the First Amendment? What is it actually about? To my mind, it's actually about the clarity of what it is that the university needs to do to fulfill its missions at the highest possible level. And those missions are really twofold. They're to educate students in the most empowering way that we can, and it's to produce ideas through our research that ideas of power across multiple ranges of human endeavor. What we're seeing right now on many university campuses, and why I felt compelled to write that op-ed in the journal, is that the whole nature of discourse on campuses is being challenged. So it's been a clear principle of the University of Chicago from its inception, and it's been reinforced by many of my predecessors, and I felt it important to reinforce it myself, that an environment that produces the most empowering education needs to be one of constant intellectual challenge. Assumptions need to be challenged. Students need to acquire intellectual skills and habits of mind where they can challenge their own assumptions, recognize power and limitations of argument, and be able to analyze and integrate a whole variety of perspectives. And the only environment that can take place in is one where there is this constant intellectual exchange, constant intellectual challenge, and so that free expression on university campuses becomes absolutely essential if you are ambitious about the type of education you want to give. If you're less ambitious about it, you don't care about imparting these skills, well, then you can do other things. But if you want to genuinely be ambitious about delivering a high-quality education, this is important. Now, what are you seeing on campuses? So around examples. We're all familiar with some of these very high-profile type of examples in which speakers have been disinvited, shouted down, interrupted in all sorts of ways. These are getting a lot of attention. They should get a lot of attention because I think they're extremely destructive to a university environment. But something that gets a little less public attention, but I think is absolutely essential, is the question of what is happening on the ground. How are students feeling about their capacity to hold and articulate controversial positions that may be at odds with what their friends think? Is there an environment on the ground in which people actually talk and argue with each other, or is there an environment in which everybody is reinforcing themselves and congratulating themselves on how right they are? And I think way too much what you're seeing in these Public events are, in a way, a kind of tip of the iceberg where they're symptoms of what's happening in a deeper way on the ground, and that also needs to be combated.
Do you see that happening at your university?
The University of Chicago, I would say, is not immune from this. I think we are in better shape than most for several reasons. One is the nature of the culture that's existed at the university for a long time. Second is because there is a deep belief on the part of most faculty around the importance of this. There's not uniform agreement about this, but I would say most faculty at the university have a serious commitment to this, and we've also taken a very clear institutional stand that we're very clear about what we think an education is. But it would be disingenuous to say that we're immune from all of this, because we're not.
There are some schools that have pursued policies that are, well, quite easy to caricature, actually. And I want to share a publication that came out from Oberlin College, which is a very respectable institution. And in 2014, its administration put together a committee which published a sexual offense resource guide. And now this was specifically a guide for professors who might have students who were at some point victims of sexual assault or sexual harassment and were traumatized by them. And the argument to the faculty from the administration was, you teachers are going to often be the first responders in certain situations. You might be the person that a student confides in. You might be aware of something happening in a classroom. You need to know, here's our policy about what we want you to do. But the part that really got a lot of attention and ridicule, I'm going to quote it. It was calling for giving trigger warnings. And I'll just very briefly go over the notion of a trigger warning. As I understand it, and please correct me on any of this, but the notion would be that if a teacher is going to introduce material either through the syllabus or in the classroom lecture or in the beginning of a discussion where the topic might be perceived to be upsetting in a deep way, a serious way, to a particular student, to announce to the class, we're going to be getting into such and such topic. And with the idea of giving the student a minimum a warning to brace yourself or an opportunity to leave the classroom or figure out something else to do. So this concept of trigger warning is very, very controversial. But Oberlin was going to go in whole hog on this. I'm quoting, this is what they were telling the faculty: triggers are not only relevant to sexual misconduct, but also to anything that might cause trauma. Be aware of racism, classism, sexism, heterosexism, sexism, ableism, and other issues of privilege and oppression. Realize that all forms of violence are traumatic and that your students have lives before and outside your classroom, experiences you may not expect or understand. Anything could be a trigger. That's in quotations. Anything can be a trigger. And professors are advised to remove triggering material when it does not contribute directly to the course learning goals. In the event that a work is too important to avoid, professors could issue a trigger warning by avoiding spoilers, but by giving a hint about what might be triggering in the material and explaining its academic value. What I hear that, now again, it's easy to ridicule that, and this was ridiculed to the degree that Oberlin backed off and dropped this. But what I also heard Oberlin trying to do was to thread a needle. That Oberlin is not a school that's not committed to, on its face, to free expression, but that it had a sense that there were other interests. There was a conflict of interest. Mm-hmm. that there were students in certain situations whose trauma would be significant enough that maybe something should be done in advance of triggering that trauma. I just want to ask. You shrugged a little bit when I said threading a needle. But you don't think there is a competing interest on the other side, which may or may not be compelling, but is actually there?
Right. I wouldn't describe it as a competing interest. Mm. So I think any discussion that pretends that there's not a deep history of exclusionary behavior in our society, like every other society, that's just a disingenuous position. Mm-hmm. Of course, this long list of issues, there are these deep histories of exclusionary behavior and violent behavior, and these are things that people have to deal with. And I think one needs to recognize it, and universities need to recognize it. But the question is, how are you going to be dealing with that? Are you going to be dealing with it by talking about it, by helping people talk about it, by looking at situations that people can explain how they're feeling, or what people said, how they feel about it? Or are you going to create a chilled environment for discourse by putting every faculty member on the spot for violating university policy, for not tiptoeing in the proper way around these things? So, I think what we're seeing in a lot of issues about free expression are the people of goodwill trying to respond to people's personal difficulties, to countries' historic difficulties, mm-hmm. But they're doing it in what I feel is a very misguided way. I feel the particularly around issues of diversity and traditionally unempowered groups. The goal should be to empower them with the strongest possible education you could give them, not allow them to participate in a full way in the most challenging and empowering education you can give them. So I just feel that a lot of these kinds of things are well-meaning. These are not evil people. They're not dumb people, but they're making misguided decisions.
Often it is heard that the left wants to suppress free speech, and you're saying that you would not characterize it as a primary goal to suppress free speech, but that it's a perhaps unfortunate side effect of a desire to protect certain people.
Well, I think there are...
Though misguided.
That I think is probably going a little too far as the characterization of what I was saying in the following sense. There are multiple reasons that people don't like free speech. We've been talking about one where I think there are, in fact, people of goodwill who are trying to figure things out, where I have, I think, a very clear view as to how it should be, their issues should be addressed, which should not be addressed by constraining speech and discourse, because it fails to empower exactly the people that they're worried about. On the other hand, there's a whole other thread, and this is a long line of people with very strong political or moral views who just don't want to hear and don't want to allow people with views that they think are totally wrong. They don't want them to speak. They think they're in favor of speech for themselves, but not for people that they fundamentally disagree with. And you get this over history. It's a long thread. It comes up at various times. It's not a left or right issue. It's a both left and right issue. Mm-hmm. So it's not assigned over history to one particular political group. But one should not underestimate this as an effect also. There are people with very strong political views. The country is getting increasingly polarized. Discourse is breaking down in a not comfortable way, and you're seeing this manifestation of this on university campuses by having groups who basically have effectively political agendas and want to arrogate for themselves the right to speak. So there are multiple things going on.
So multiple strands of this
Yes.
Dynamic.
Right.
And you were talking about a more historic perspective on this. I'm guessing that you would be reflecting back, for example, to the McCarthy period, when if you were a communist on campus and labeled as such, you were out. And nobody wanted to give you an opportunity to speak. That was not seen as valid speech. And you would have argued that communist professor should have been protected. His right to speak should have been protected.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the University of Chicago was actually deeply involved in cases like this. And the president at the time, Robert Maynard Hutchins, was very clear and very strong in that position, in exactly that position.
Can we talk a little bit about some of the definitions surrounding this conversation today? And one of them, we talked a little bit about trigger warnings, but another one is safe spaces. I recently moderated an Intelligence Squared debate on this whole issue, and we found ourselves getting a little bit muddy in the area of what we meant by a safe space. Some people were arguing for safe spaces on campus, but by that they meant something like a Hillel house or a Black Students Association house, a club essentially where people could go and be with other people like them and talk, let their hair down basically and not be, if you're a Jewish student, however you might feel about Israeli policy, not have to debate it with somebody who wanted to argue with you about Israeli policy. And there was that notion of safe space, and everybody kind of agreed that that's okay. Why not have a club where we hang out with people we like and we make their rules? And then there was the second question of, should classrooms be safe spaces? Should classrooms be places where certain topics are off the table or not? I just wanted to ask you about whether you think that distinction is a real one and a meaningful one.
I think it is a real and meaningful one, but I would go a step further around these questions around Hillel or spaces for African American students and so on. So at the University of Chicago, we actually do not allow formal student organizations or any group to be exclusionary. So you cannot have a group where you say, this is a group and there are no Jewish students allowed, or there are no African American students allowed, or there are no Republicans allowed. You can't exclude people. We do not have exclusionary organizations. So if one means by a safe space a place where you can formally structure inside the university a space or organization where you are protected from dealing with other students, we do not have such organizations.
Is that an unusual position for the university compared to other universities?
Yeah. I don't know the answer, actually. I'm not 100% sure. But, it's a very interesting thing because you can look at some of these, of the idea of, well, we want the space where only X person can come in. Well, this is just sort of a flip side of what has been an unbelievable history of exclusionary behavior of all the institutions of the country, which we've been working very hard to get out of for decades, and we're way better than we were.
So if there has been a legacy at a particular institution of fraternities blacklisting Jewish students, the solution of Jewish students starting their own fraternity is, for you, not a solution. That would not be the way to go.
I think that's a natural response. However, and it's a perfectly natural response inside a university that's going to allow formal groups associated with the university to actually be being exclusionary. I think a better structure is to not have an exclusionary environment. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not the case that when you have either a Hillel or a Center for Students of Color and so on, that most of the people there are going to be what the stated purpose of the organization was, and that's fine. But it's just this idea that things are safe in the sense that we prohibit others, that's problematic. Now, nobody's saying, look, if you're in your residence hall and you have you have 3 roommates that you have to invite anybody in. I mean, that's a residential environment. So there, I would certainly feel way more. I mean, obviously, you want people to feel comfortable in their home.
Right. But then let's move it to the notion of safe spaces in the classroom. And again, I think Oberlin's project was to make sure that classrooms had this kind of notion of safety by bringing up the issue of trigger warnings. Your dean in 2000, John Ellison, again, around the time that you published the Wall Street Journal article, he wrote a letter to freshmen, incoming freshmen, welcoming them as he always does to the school, but really forthrightly saying, do not expect safe spaces, do not expect trigger warnings at our school. I wanted to see if I had a quotation on that, but I don't, but it's not necessary. He just made it clear there are no safe spaces at the University of Chicago. When I was reading into that, I bounced across a critique of the experience of being a University of Chicago student when you're a person of color. I'm sure you're familiar with this. A student who graduated in 2015 named Cameron Okeke. He wrote a piece in Vox, and basically the headline was, if you want diversity, you have to have safe spaces. And his argument was that as a black student, he felt the campus, due to a long history and heritage, felt marginalized on the campus. He wrote, as a first-generation black student, I needed safe spaces like the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs, not to hide from ideas and perspectives at odds with my own, but to heal from relentless hate and ignorance, to hear and be heard. In this place, he said, my ideas were challenged, but never my humanity. I mattered. And then I thought the thing that he really brought home to the kind of experience that he's having in the classroom, he says, and I can't vouch for any of this, but I just want to share what he said, that if you're a student of color, you should know that you can speak up in class without having white students around you muttering about affirmative action. That's the way he put it. And his argument, without going to the next step, he said, I want those students to be silenced on the issue of affirmative action, because once they start talking about affirmative action, they're challenging my right to be there. And that's different from a sort of argument about whether you're for free markets or for government regulation, because it goes to the nature of who he is. And so this case that's being made is that we're in a period where universities have reached out to much more diverse groups than in the past, over the past 20 years, have successfully brought many of those groups into the university, and that their particular profiles actually change the equation for the whole notion of free speech. That it was, back in the 50s when everybody at Yale was white and male, they could make fun of each other for being from Montana or Florida or whatever their degree of diversity was, but they weren't fundamentally threatening, I guess, their sense of who they were and their right to be there. This guy, Okeke, is saying this kind of stuff is different. I just want to take that to you because it's a fairly well-articulated argument, and see how seriously you take it.
Yeah. Again, I think imagine doing that. So imagine you now open the field up to saying, well, what are the topics that any group or individual actually feels that is threatening to them or diminishing them? And now you're going to have the committee that's going to be deciding which things fall into this category and which things don't. Mm-hmm. You're going to have a committee that's going to have to adjudicate, well, did this particular language do that or did it not? And you now enter into a world of a dramatically chilled environment of what it is you can say and what you can't say. And what you've succeeded in doing is diminishing the nature of discourse on campus and the quality of this for everybody. You can't minimize this. When you say, oh, this is what should happen, how are you going to make it happen? The way you make it happen is you actually have to have a process. You have to have a structure. You have to have somebody's going to be deciding. And everybody imagines it's either obvious or that everybody's going to decide what they want and so on. But it's a very fraught situation to go in that direction. Now, that doesn't mean one shouldn't take the underlying issue that he's raising in a serious way. There are all sorts of reasons that people can feel that that the nature of discourse is upsetting to them, and in some cases legitimately. Mm-hmm. So I mean, you sympathize with them and say, why is that person acting like a jerk? But the fact that sometimes people do that, or they bring up topics, or they have points of view that are disturbing, the way to deal with that is actually to have conversations about it and not to set up a bureaucracy mm-hmm. that's going to make judgments every time about what's permissible and what isn't.
The University of Chicago is also famous in this whole conversation for having formulated in 2014 a draft statement, not a draft statement, an official statement. You actually set this in motion, put together a committee to formulate the university's position on free speech, and I think you've already explained what it is in more prosaic terms. But they actually carved out exceptions. Your statement carved out exceptions to free speech, some pretty obvious ones. They include expressions that violates the law, that defames a specific individual, that constitutes a genuine threat, that invades privacy or confidentiality, and also that constitutes harassment. And in terms of you're just saying there would have to be a kind of crazy bureaucracy to navigate a world in which uncomfortable speech was going to be legislated. Is there not already such a decision-making process in place to have to figure out what constitutes harassment?
There is, and
does that function okay?
It functions okay, but it's also operating inside a culture and a context. And I think so what is the issue that you're actually raising here, and as the committee reflected? There's no such thing as a principle that applies under every possible situation, mm-hmm. And so you're always confronted with where are you going to be drawing a line, and the question of drawing a line at a place that's going to well, let me say two things. First, you have to draw the line, and then you have to have a culture that implements it. And what is the nature of that environment? And I think the question is, where are you drawing a line in such a way that it's going to fundamentally undermine the nature of discourse that you want on campus, and where are you drawing it so that you're trying to protect against that? Mm-hmm. And I think it is an absolutely fair question of do you see these things as competing values, and where can you effectively draw the line? And I think that from the point of view of creating a culture that has been very effective and pretty distinctive, honestly, and maybe more distinctive today than in the past, around creating an environment where most students feel highly empowered and well educated by their experience is what we're very focused on. So, again, it's how are you going to set the tone? What's the message you're going to be conveying? Every statement that comes out of a kind of a university position ultimately has some impact on the nature of the culture that that takes place.
And I'll share also in terms of the impact of Chicago's thinking on this, is that this statement has been actually adopted pretty much verbatim by at least 40 universities around the country now, including Princeton and Purdue. And the president of Purdue said, "We don't need to change a word. It's so well written." And they're now referred to as the Chicago Principles. So if you hear that come up in this conversation, that's what this is referring to. There's been some research done by Jonathan Haidt about the cohort of students who were born after 1995, who are kind of, sweet spot of students who are at university now. And he makes an argument that they were educated to be sensitive to, they got a lot of education about bullying and about intimidation that started at the turn of the millennium when they were in kindergarten, that wasn't in place before, at a time when there was a lot of concern about children being badly treated. The programs were put in place to teach them how to be better citizens, more compassionate citizens, et cetera. And his argument is that having carried forward these values which have been instilled in them, now that they're in university, they're part of the reason that this pushback against completely robust and open and robust speech exists. And he also suggests that they have a diminished interest in free speech itself. They don't see it as the highest value. They see protection of the vulnerable as a higher value. I'm not going to ask you to comment on that because you're a mathematician, not a sociologist or a psychologist, but I do know that you've been visiting high schools. You've been going around talking to heads of high schools about getting their students ready for coming into the university world now. So talk to me a little bit about those conversations, and do you pick up any note of this idea that there's a group of students who are just made differently than students in the past?
Well, so let me talk about the high school. So when you really think about what's happening, I mean, a lot of the driver of this is, and by this I mean the idea that discourse is not open and challenging discourse is not as high a value as, at least the way I'm articulating it, is that it is true that there are a lot of students who are not ready for this environment of open and challenging discourse.
And more so than in the past.
Well, that's a good question. That's a claim he makes, and I'm not 100% certain that's the case. I just I don't have enough knowledge to make that assertion. But what I will say is that the natural question arises when you have all these students every year pouring into universities, and at least many of them, as articulated by them, are very sympathetic to way more constraints on speech than certainly the position that I'm taking. Is you say, well, how is this happening? I mean, why is it happening? And one natural question is, what is happening in high schools and what is happening in schools? Goes back to your quotes. So I have been meeting with high school leaders and asking them the following question, which is, you purposefully prepare your students to be able to take calculus or advanced calculus in college. You purposefully prepare your students to be able to write a paper in history or English class when they get to college. Forget about whether you're doing a good job or not and so on, but you're taking that as your job. It's purposeful work done by the high schools. And now you ask, are you purposefully preparing students to be in an environment of open discourse, free expression, and intellectual challenge, or not? And I think most high school leaders that I've spoken to have said that, in fact, they believe more would need to be done for them to be making a claim that they are really preparing students in that way. They all do something, But I think the backdrop to the environment is not one where that's happening automatically, and when they get to college, there's an issue. I think it's also true that you can say, well, what are colleges doing? Are you actually talking about this when you're recruiting students? Are you talking about it as a core part of who you are? What is it you're actually telling students about what their experience is going to be and what your education consists of? What is your point of view about education? What does that mean? Mm-hmm. And does that include an actual component of intellectual challenge? Your assumptions about the world are going to be challenged. Is that a piece of education or not? And if we're not saying that, and by we, I mean in higher education, and if high schools are not telling people that's a piece of what a college education's about, why do we expect the students to all of a sudden by themselves know this? So I don't put quite so much weight as you were referring to on that it's somehow students' fault so much as are the adults involved? Are the high schools, are the colleges actually doing their job?
I want to go to questions. So the way that will work is there will be some microphones set up in the aisles, and if you can just line up behind the mics and ask a question. And while that's being set up, very briefly, because I do want to get to the questions, when the high school heads admitted they weren't quite getting their students up to this, did they explain why?
I think it was a question of it not being
they hadn't thought of it.
Formal program. Well, they had thought of it. I mean, a lot of them were extremely thoughtful about this and sort of took the issue very seriously and were doing things that they felt were advancing students in that direction. So it's not as if they were unaware of it. But the way I phrased the question, that it really needs kind of purposeful work to do that, especially in the environment we're in now, was, I think, sort of what they were reflecting on, that kind of purposeful programmatic preparation in that way probably needed more thought and more work.
Oh, we have a lot of questions. Start over here.
I was hoping that you were going to address what happens on a college campus when a speaker or a group is allowed, either through invitation of the college or of a student group, which does not necessarily exist at the University of Chicago, comes on campus and delivers makes a presentation that is provocative either for something or against something. The ones that are against freedom of speech or are for anti-immigration, anti-Semitism, whatever the sociological issue or even political issue that is therefore so sensitive. And these speeches are not generally set up as open debates, they're set up as presentations. And the students who may not be prepared to deal in an organized debate fashion become enraged and don't know what to do with their strong emotions of how they feel they are affected by this kind of provocative, inflammatory speech. How should a university environment deal with this? Should they allow these kinds of speeches? And if they agree they should, then what forums are they providing for opposition to these positions since we can't as adults seem to get to the point where we can communicate, what are universities doing to enable students to be able to deal with these very, very difficult situations that we're facing in our country right now?
Yeah, so what are universities doing? Different universities are doing different things. So let me just sort of talk about my own university and how we would think about that. So first, part of the reason that I felt it was so important to have a very clear statement, and John alluded to this, that what became known as the Chicago Principles, because you need a place to stand. You need a perspective You need some principles that you can talk to the entire community about. And why is it important to have, to allow people to speak? That's one thing. And that forms a backdrop of how you deal with everything. Second is that the way people get invited to the University of Chicago to speak is that a faculty member invites them or a student group invites them. Nobody has a right to speak at the University of Chicago. Nobody can walk on campus and say, I am hereby asserting my right to give a talk in the University of Chicago. We're not subject to the First Amendment. We're a private institution. Just random people don't come to speak. They get invited because some student group or some faculty member wants to hear what they have to say, maybe challenge what they have to say, but they want them involved in the discourse. And so everybody needs to understand that they need, just as they have a right to invite who they want, and that we are going to protect that right, they need to respect the rights of others to hear who they want, even if they totally disagree or are offended by that person. And that's a framework that you have to have. If you don't have that framework, what is the basis on which you're making decisions? Okay, now you come down to it, and what happens? We're very clear that protest is an entirely admissible, in every sense, form of free expression. People can protest all they want. What they cannot do is disrupt the speaker, and they cannot prevent other people from listening. I mean, when you disrupt, you think about it as disrupting speech, but what you are actually doing is you are eliminating the capacity of other faculty and students at the university who want to hear what this person has to say from hearing them. You are disrupting the functioning of an educational institution. So we're very clear that you can protest all you want, you can have counter events, you can do all sorts of things that you want, you just cannot disrupt. Now, the extent to which people, again, feel upset and emotionally upset by something somebody has to say, those are things universities should be addressing, but they should be addressing them through conversation with students, through conversations with groups, not through saying, oh my God, we can never let somebody speak again.
There's also often a misunderstanding that an invitation amounts to endorsement. That's number one. And number two, there's a misunderstanding that an invitation to campus means that the university has invited them. And at Chicago, and I think most other universities, it's an individual group or an individual professor. It's not an invitation from the university.
This is exactly right, and it's an absolutely essential point. I mean, we actually don't invite anybody. I mean, it's some faculty group, it's some student group who invites people as part of the process of engagement. What's the job of the university is to provide an environment that is, what I would say is maximally non-chilled, so that all sorts of people can be invited with all sorts of perspectives, speak in all sorts of ways, and engage in discourse. That's what our job is, and then the faculty and students have that whole intellectual engagement experience.
Pierre, please.
Yeah, thank you. We're living in an age of alternative truths and fake news. And I was just wondering if you could comment on the university's policy of how that fits into your framework of free expression, and what you think the university's role is in trying to bring some order to this phenomenon.
Yeah, so the issue for universities is always that it needs to be a place of argument. So making assertions, just sort of random assertions, is not really of any value unless you can support it with argument and be challenged. So we have a very different sort of environment. Exactly sort of what we do around the nature of national discourse, I think the most important thing we can do is, in fact, continue to emphasize the actual importance of discourse, of argument, of not demonizing people who disagree with you, and saying that simply loud assertions are not the same thing as an argument.
Up here?
My impression was that, or has been, that the nuttiness over Halloween costumes and trigger warnings and stuff has been on the wane in the last several years, but that what's been rising has been a view among Republicans that was reflected in that Pew poll that made such an explosion last spring, that higher education is a negative for the country, has a negative impact on the country. If we have only two political parties and one of them adopts the view that universities and colleges and universities are a bad thing for the United States, that seems to me to be an existential threat for higher education, and I wondered if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I think it's a very serious problem. And interestingly, we're, at the University of Chicago, we're used to talking about ourselves and some of the institutions that we compare ourselves to, and who all of those are. But if you actually look at where higher education takes place, mostly it's in public institutions. 75% of the students who are in a higher education institution are in a publicly supported institution. So layers of state universities, municipal colleges, community colleges. In real terms, aside from the statements you're quoting, in real terms over the last 2 decades, the decrease in the public support for higher education as a public good, as expressed through state legislators who are reflecting the people who vote for them, has gone down dramatically. It is startling to look at the level of decrease in support for public higher education. And so these statements that are coming out are, I would say, part of a general questioning by people in the United States about the value of the public institutions of higher education. And I think it's a huge national problem that people think that this is not a value. This has been the vehicle for in so many ways, building the country, building the infrastructure of the country, both in terms of human capacity and in terms of ideas that have generated the economy and ensured national security, that it is startling as to how this is happening. And it's not happening only in Republican-dominated states.
We're at the end of our time, so I want to encourage you to approach Bob Zimmer out in the grass, out on the lawn. He's got a lot more to say about this. And I also just wanted to share, as a matter of full disclosure, and it's not why we were paired up here, that I have a son who's entering his 4th year at the University of Chicago. And a couple of years ago, there was an incident near the campus where somebody tweeted that he was going to come on campus and shoot it up, something like that. And campus went on lockdown. And my son told me he went to breakfast in the dining hall, and he was sort of bleary-eyed, and he was sitting there eating his cornflakes, and suddenly a man in a suit was standing right in front of him saying basically, "Are you okay?" And he looked up, and the president of the University of Chicago was in the cafeteria making the rounds to see if the students were okay during that stressful time. So I just wanted to say, that seems awfully sensitive on your part. Thank you, Bob Zimmer.
Thank you.